Good afternoon, my name's Mark Butler. I'm here in the offices of Macro Plan Demazi in Melbourne. It's now in late July 2012 and I'd like to introduce you to Brian Haratzis. Good afternoon, Brian.
How are you, Mark?
I think it's apt at this time. Brian, we've just commissioned through Macro Plan Demazi to undertake an extensive review of the West Australian property market. So those not within the West Australian market can understand where it's travelling, what it's done, what's the history, and then some predictions of what we're going to do in the next 2 to 3 years, and what are some of the key drivers, which not everyone understands. And Brian, what were probably the top 3 things you found out from the report?
Well, I guess the top 3 things are firstly that the next resources super cycle won't be like the last one. This is not about iron ore, it's about LNG, and LNG contracts are very long term, which means that the projects will be over a much longer term, and it also means that the type of professionals and the type of construction staff and operational staff will be very different, and this will map out into a different property market. So that's the first thing. The second thing that we've really learned is that actually the property implications have not yet been felt in Perth. And the third thing I think that's really important is that there are sectors in the property market which have not as yet really been mined by West Australian developers. And I'll give you one example, Mark, business parks. For example, there's not a history of business parks. So from an Eastern Seaboard perspective and a national perspective, there's a very interesting set of circumstances evolving in West Australia.
So the idea is that you're saying, is the market in West Australia similar to the market in Melbourne, residentially?
No, it's very different. There are not only is it spatially different, but it's in a different stage of its life cycle. So a good example of that would mean that Melbourne, 20 years ago, Melbourne didn't really have the residential population in and around the CBD. Perth doesn't have it yet, it is just beginning to get it. So we haven't seen all of the knock-on impacts. So for example, major retail development on the coattails of residential development hasn't happened because the residential hasn't happened. So the virtuous cycle of inner city living is really in its infancy. In addition to that, when you have a hard look at the types of apartments that are being built in and around Perth, there is not a tradition of medium density as there is on the Eastern Seaboard, and that will begin because Perth has quite an old population.
Macro Plan Demazi are all about numbers and analysing. And the great thing about the numbers will tell you the trend. I mean, the population growth for WA, where is that now? Where do you see that in the next 2 years, say?
Well, Australia's population growth at the moment is around 1.7%, and that's based on the latest census data. West Australia is growing at about 2.4% per annum in terms of its population. That's actually at a very high rate. At the peak of the boom, West Australia was growing at 3% per annum on a compound basis. Now, West Australia would be growing at a 3% per annum compound basis for a population, but for changes in federal government policy. And so what's happened, Mark, is that the federal government has reduced the amount of immigration into Australia by cutting back on 457 visas, which are very important in West Australia, and student visas. So net overseas migration in Australia has almost halved, from 308,000 in the peak, which is in 2008, back down to 180,000 today. My view is that within the next 3 years, it will need to go back to 240, 250,000, which would mean that the West Australian population growth number could get back close to that 3% boom period outcome.
If you look at the price, I think that I understand now, living in West Australia, that not everyone understands where the prices of the properties are, and that you might say generally industrial, office and residential apartments and houses. Where have you seen them tracking and where do you see them going forward in the medium term?
West Australia, once again, quite a different market. If we looked at fringe housing and subdivisional land, there is no doubt that parts of the market were over-subdivided. And so, for example, there's still some overhang in some of the land markets. So it's very patchy. What can happen in some of the better estates are selling quite well at the moment, but you can see in other areas there's still some distressed sales. So what we're getting is the last vestiges of the GFC overbuild, but we're starting to see a pickup in first home buyers. We've started to see rents grab a lot in and around central Perth for apartments. Off our numbers, rents have increased around 15% since January this year, and there is very little new supply coming on. So we're expecting that will continue to grab. Middle ring suburbs have gone sideways for a long time now. We're expecting those to start to improve as well.
Have you seen a growth in the volume in those areas?
One of the interesting things is that volumes have actually increased quite dramatically, not reflected in price as yet. Our expectation is in 12 to 24 months that we will start to see the price impacts.
Am I right that one thing that comes out of your report, one thing we know from living in West Australia, but again those outside, is you talk about the LNG drive, and we're talking about, I think, of the $180 billion of expenditure, capex in that mining area. Is it about half or 60% is LNG driven?
That's right. It's about 65% is LNG driven, which is not widely known. And some of the sorts of things that are important about that is that it actually drives a marine services industry, Mark. And the thing about that is that it's very labour intensive and it's operational. So, for example, you need fuel dumps, you need fuel ships, you need slips and slippage, you need marine engineers. This is a very different industry to iron ore. And so beginning to understand how that maps into a property market means that it creates an opportunity for people to understand where else in the market they can fit.
And I think the other thing which we understand is it's a very clean energy. There has been some reaction against the uranium mining, and so it's a very good, clean alternative to that. And then also the profitability from the actual mining or producing the LNG is up there with iron ore, with 30-year contracts.
Oh, absolutely. You cannot begin to undertake your investment in LNG without your pre-sale. And the pre-sales have got significant margins in them. And they're very long build projects as well. So we're talking 3 to 5 year build. So this is we're talking about something that's quite different. It's interesting at the moment. You talk about uranium in Japan at the moment. The government's actually going through thinking. They've got 3 scenarios for future energy, and the scenario that most of the analysts will tell you is that they will be increasing LNG purchases, and by the way, Australia is Japan's main supplier of LNG. They'll be increasing that from around 5% of their total energy consumption to between 15 and 25%. That's just Japan. So we're seeing and thinking that the Asian story in LNG is going to be a very big one for Australia.
So, I mean, they're great because West Australia has its strong drivers. It has a good population, it has population growth. We have dwindling vacancy factor in the residential, a commercial office market which is very tight. Retail sales, I think, are difficult everywhere, but they're still probably a little better in West Australia. So therefore, you'd say the outlook for residential and for generally property in the next 12 to 2 or 3 years is reasonably strong in West Australia?
Yes, I would. I think generalising is always difficult. I think there's several of the residential markets are very good. And I would instance that not just in central Perth, but in inner Perth, and so places like, for example, Subiaco, I'm expecting to come back fairly big time. One of the reasons I say that is because one of the interesting spin-offs in LNG and mining is that they're based on contractors. And contractors like to have smaller offices, they like to be distributed. And so, for anyone visiting Perth, when you jump in the taxi, please don't get on the phone. What you should do is actually look out on the Great Eastern Highway and have a look at the contractors, Leighton's and Garda, as we go down the Great Eastern Highway, because that's where they want to be. But equally, the professionals also would like to be in and around the western suburbs. And so Subiaco, whilst, for example, has been a very soft market for offices, is likely to come back quite strongly. So
when it's so strong in West Australia, in West Perth, and then also strong in the city, it has to be, because it's like the infill part.
Well, absolutely. And again, for those who aren't really conversant with Perth, a strong suggestion would be Black Tom's on a Friday to actually go and have a look at where the mining industry congregates. Because if you want to understand what's going on, you need to just stand there with a beer and actually just listen to what people are saying. Because that is, for example, that's a hub of thinking and ideas and money in Perth.
And then, if we're then saying that it seems generally that the outlook is reasonably positive for Perth, and we do have the report from Macro Plan Damasi, which is available by just, if you send an email to info@otan.com.au, info@otan.com.au, it's freely available to be emailed out to you. But then also, OTAN has projects in the north, in the Pilbara area. I know you're very conversant with the Pilbara area. It is a boom and bust is the thought process. Where do you see that at the cycle at the moment in that Pilbara, Port Hedland, Karratha area at the moment?
Well, it's really important in the Pilbara to understand there's two key parts. There's the Port Hedland and there's Karratha. Karratha is a much more diversified economy than Port Hedland. Karratha, it really is the hub of the LNG industry, and it has iron ore, it has Rio Tinto, it has Dampier as well. So Karratha, for example, has twice as many seat numbers in terms of air flights in and out to Port Hedland. But Karratha has a broader property market. Port Hedland, on the other hand, which is driven by iron ore and BHP, FMG, Atlas are the core, is very constrained for land. And the opportunity in Port Hedland is actually to unlock land in the short term. Karratha is a much more diverse economy, and it's not just about unlocking land, it's about developing. So it's about accommodation, it's about residential subdivision, it's about camps, and the future of the Karratha airport is likely that it will become a major hub. In fact, you know, in the old days people used to say Broome will be the new international airport. Well, I think it'll be Karratha.
On that point, as I said, info@otan.com.au, happy to send you out the report. If you're interested in some of the projects which OTAN are doing, also register your interest at the website, which is www.otan.com.au. And I'd really like to thank the association with Macro Plan Damazi for their independent report, because again it gives us the guidance where we can look after our investors' funds the better. Thank you very much.
Thank you.